Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'm Deb Radcliffe, Strategic Analyst at Cyber Risk Alliance. I'm happy to moderate today's broadcast titled Unleash and Secure the Cloud with Zero Trust Access, featuring John Grady, Senior Analyst with ESG, and Colby Dyess, Director of Product Management at Appgate. But before we get started, let's go over some housekeeping. If you'd like to ask questions, please select the Q&A button below. If you're interested in accessing additional resources provided by our sponsor, select the handouts button below. Also, note that a recording of today's presentation will be made available on demand after the event. And now we turn the discussion over to our experts.
Thanks so much, Deb. So my name is John Grady. As Deb mentioned, I'm a senior analyst with ESG. So today's agenda is pretty straightforward. Happy to be joined by Colby Dyess. We'll go back and forth a little bit on some of these topics. I'm going to start with some background on Zero Trust, how organizations thinking about it, where's adoption, things like that. Then we'll take a step back and really look at where organizations are with cloud adoption. And obviously we know that's accelerating, but it's kind of nuanced. I'll share some data that ESG has on that front. Then we'll get into the challenges that cloud adoption create for organizations. I'll turn it over to Colby to talk about how Appgate approaches cloud access with its SDP solution, and then we'll wrap up with some recommendations. So the rise of Zero Trust security. I think most people on this webinar, hopefully everyone, has heard of Zero Trust, has some awareness really of what it is, kind of understands the tagline, never trust, always verify, and how that really boils down to removing any implicit trust from the environment. So at a very high level, we understand that, previously we had a very well-defined perimeter. Everything inside was kind of trusted, outside it wasn't. That wasn't a great model, even when that perimeter was well-defined. But now, as things have become much more distributed and you have resources and employees increasingly outside of the corporate environment, that's fundamentally flawed and predicating trust on location, and you need to treat everything as suspect. So we understand never trust, always verify, but as you kind of layer down, you can go in some different directions with Zero Trust. And so the data you're looking at here is from a recent study that we did, and we provided respondents with 3 definitions. And there's a lot of text, I won't read all of these, but the first one, the key word there is a security strategy. So kind of a overarching framework that brings in least privilege and continuous verification and things like that. The next 2 definitions really focus on technologies and tools. And again, least privilege is part of this, limiting east-west movement, things like that. But it's, again, predicated on the tools supporting Zero Trust. And we asked this question 2 ways. What is most closely aligned with your view, and kind of check all that apply. So the light blue bars, you can see there's overlap here. A lot of respondents understand that, these aren't wrong. There's aspects of Zero Trust in all of these. But when forced to choose one, you can look at this kind of glass half empty, half full, where plurality say it's a security strategy, but in the aggregate, a lot of folks still point at tools and technologies. And so this is an improvement from where we saw things, a year or 2 ago. But at bottom line is there's still confusion in the market, and organizations in a lot of cases really aren't sure what to make of Zero Trust.
But it's a good sign, right? That you're getting 43% of the folks can understand that this is a full strategy. And it makes a lot of sense to me that we still have a lot of folks who are kind of focusing a lot on the tools and the technology. It's hard to change our habits, and taking a Zero Trust approach is a little bit different. And it does involve changing practices. So we'll talk more about that, of course. But to me, this is a great sign to see more folks understand the big picture here.
No question. Directionally, it's definitely a positive, but confusion remains. And so I think we're getting better. We're absolutely on the right track. But I think it just shows where that gap was maybe when we started, even though it's improving. So I think, it's also helpful to think about what's pushing organizations towards Zero Trust. And so more and more we see organizations thinking about this kind of through the lens of modernizing cybersecurity. And I think the work the federal government's done and the executive order that the Biden administration put forth really highlighted this. Hey, your entire IT environment is fundamentally different than it was a few years ago. We need security to change to catch up, and zero trust is a good avenue to deal with those challenges and get things from a security perspective more in line with where IT is more generally. That said, some organizations are coming at this from, I want fewer breaches. I want, fewer incidents, which I think everyone does, but that's their main driver. It's more tactical. And then others are looking at kind of broader IT initiatives such as digital transformation or more specifically cloud adoption and trying to enable those initiatives through something like zero trust and making sure security can help. And so that's why we see kind of these two different approaches. Organizations that have broadly implemented zero trust across the organization, you can see 46% say they've done that, versus the 43% who say they're use case focused. So it really comes down to how you're thinking about it. And I should point out, this isn't indicative of kind of the world at large. This study was focused on organizations that had some awareness, understanding of zero trust, and were more likely to kind of be down the path. To me, it's still really telling that almost half say that they're in the process of doing this broadly. I think, Colby, to your point, and things changing a year ago, it would have been much more use case oriented. We're seeing more of a shift towards, broader implementations. But it doesn't have to be. There's a lot of different ways to get at this, focusing on a use case, looking at the tools in your environment and kind of, choosing that path. Not that that's necessarily right, but you can do that. Or taking kind of a tops down strategic view of this, developing a plan for, 2, 3, 4 years out and then executing on it.
Is there something similar you saw in those organizations, like in that 46% group? Something that sort of signals that, that's what we commonly see in those kinds of organizations?
I think those are more likely to have developed a strategy. I think when they're use case focused, they may, look at tools, take more of an ad hoc approach. If you're going to do this broadly, you kind of need that tops down direction. So you can start to align the different groups that are going to be brought to bear to support the initiative, start evaluating the tools and do so kind of coherently and cohesively across the org.
But I also imagine that the folks who started it with like the tactical or use case base, it's a good starting position. You're trying to eat an elephant, so you can take one bite at a time.
Yeah, I think that does happen a lot, but not always. Some organizations are going to say, hey, we want to improve our remote access and modernize our secure remote access. And that's all we're interested in for any number of reasons. There's definitely a correlation that the longer you've kind of been with zero trust, you're going to expand, but not always. So part of that cohort and that 43% has been doing it for just a short period of time, and they'll likely grow. But some have been at it for a few years, and they're still kind of targeted. I think, again, it's only been 3 years where this has really, really been in the mainstream, and I think a real key focus. So I think this will change over time, but that's where things are now.
Yeah, that's good.
So, what is zero trust? Where organizations with adoption? We kind of see that a lot in the market. At least I do. I don't see this quite as often, which is, what are some of the proof points? What are the successes of organizations that are investing in these initiatives and putting, resources behind them? How are they faring? And so on the left, you can see where organizations are kind of from a self-rated perspective. And I think this is a pretty realistic view, of success. So 46% say they're very successful, but 39% say we label ourselves as successful, but there were bumps in the road. We saw some challenges. We were able to overcome them. And then another 15% say it's been challenging. We're still trying to improve, but we're not there yet. That's kind of fairly self-aware to me. Sometimes you ask these questions and a lot of people want to rate themselves very highly. I think this was, fairly realistic in that self-assessment.
Yeah. This actually matches a lot of like what I've seen working with customers and the kind of things that I find really kind of neat is if you look at the increased employee satisfaction or increased user satisfaction, increased the user production. Those are really very good benefits. Sometimes they're the unexpected benefits. People weren't really thinking that that was a thing. They were just focused on the security. What I've heard from security professionals is that because they've got happier, more productive users, one of the side effect is they're fielding fewer tickets. So, if you're in the security side of the house, you don't want to sit around listening to tickets. Couldn't get access to this or couldn't get access to that. So what I've noticed is when they move to more of a zero trust model, that it ends up being better for their end users, and then it gets just to be better, more efficient within the security teams as well.
Absolutely. So you're referencing some of the data on the right side, which is the discrete benefits that these organizations have seen, and you can see they're broken out into security and business benefits. And so this was really telling for us, and you touched on a couple that if done right and you're making it transparent for the users as you should, then they're happier. If we'll talk later about kind of cloud and DevOps, but if you're plugging these strategies into those types of frameworks, they're happier as well, and you end up more secure. We didn't show this data point in the slide, but 77% of respondents said they had seen at least one security and business benefit. So the vast majority of organizations that are moving forward with zero trust are seeing multiple benefits, and they're seeing benefits across both kind of the security realm and the business realm. And so, this should help, as you're trying to gain critical mass, secure funding and really, raise awareness for why this is important. As you're trying to go to all those different stakeholders, this should satisfy a lot of different personas within the org as to why this is important and how it can help. So that's some background on zero trust. As I said, I want to take a step back and talk about cloud a bit as well. So we run an annual IT spending intentions study at ESG. So we've tracked cloud adoption for the last 15 years, and as you would expect, and as shown here on the left, it's basically ubiquitous at this point. So this is inclusive of SaaS as well as infrastructure as a service, but 94% say that they're either extensive or moderate users of public cloud. So just about everyone is in the cloud. Infrastructure as a service usage is between 75 and 80%, so that's almost as pervasive. But what's telling is in that middle graphic, of those using infrastructure as a service, 82% are using 2 or more CSPs. So it's not just that you're using, some cloud apps or pushing some resource to the cloud, but now you're in multiple clouds across infrastructure as a service, software as a service. And then the next layer down is really what those application architectures look like. And so on the right, currently a majority of workloads are still, VM or bare metal based. But within the next 2 years, users expect a majority to become microservices oriented and either containers or serverless functions. So that's hugely telling that it's going to grow to that level so quickly. I think we do have to keep in perspective that means there's still going to be a lot of applications that are on premises. And so again, this idea of kind of hybrid multi-cloud, we've used that a lot for the last couple of years. It's a reality for more and more organizations, and now it's really formalizing how kind of the management orchestration across all those different aspects of the environment can become more streamlined and more formalized. So with that cloud adoption, unfortunately, comes some level of complexity. 48% of organizations say their IT environment is more complex than 2 years ago. There's a lot of reasons that are shown on the right side here. Obviously, the pandemic and the shift to remote work has had an impact that's at the top of the list. The number of endpoints that users are accessing resources with has kind of exploded as BYOD has picked up more as a result of the pandemic. But what I've highlighted in this list is really those challenges and those aspects of kind of cloud adoption and the rise and the number and kind of scale of applications that have resulted in complexity. So the changing cybersecurity landscape, that's general, but we can tie this to cloud. As the environment becomes more distributed, you have less visibility. You're trying to defend more locations. That becomes a challenge. Attackers are using the cloud to their advantage. So even though that's general, it's still fairly cloud oriented. The second one that's highlighted there, an increase in applications leveraging new modern architectures. Showed the data point on the previous slide. There's great reasons for shifting to microservices. It's more efficient. It allows you to gain greater speed in development cycles, but whole new set of security concerns, and we'll touch on that shortly. The number of applications, I mean, obviously businesses are more reliant than ever, not just, for external facing apps that are being used by customers, but their internal employees and third parties as well. And then things like DX come into play as well, as we touched on, kind of distributed, hybrid multi-cloud and that last highlighted option there. So there's a lot going on in the environment that's leading to complexity. Quite a bit of it is tied to cloud. So there's something organizations have to navigate, but it is creating complexity.
In my current and actually even in my former roles working with organizations to help them with their digital transformation strategy, that move to cloud and then containers, microservices, Kubernetes, and all that's been going on for a real long time. So I bet that these are the kind of issues that you've seen previously. But I just say from my current experience working with customers, ever since COVID hit and suddenly everybody started working from home, there was a huge explosion. A lot of folks really interested in figuring out how to maybe use a ZTA to help address that. And I think originally they were thinking about how it'll just be like a VPN replacement. But they've come to realize that actually the ZTA approach can be broadly applied across all this environment, sort of actually give them one view. Well, I know we're going to touch on that in a little bit. But to me, it was kind of interesting that these problems have been kind of with us for a while. And then once COVID hit, I think as a market sort of stumbled into a good solution that'll help. We'll cover more of it.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I think, the work from home and the access issue is directly kind of correlated to the pandemic. But, we did research coming out of it. And again, this idea of shifting towards cloud accelerated because organizations needed, better agility and flexibility. And so to your point, yeah, these aren't new, but they have been elevated for a lot of organizations as they've put, more wood behind the arrow for their cloud migration plans. And then, yes, absolutely. That's where you tie these things together, those first two. And then the ones that I've highlighted is access and how you normalize that.
Yep.
So diving into to some of those challenges that organizations are facing, a lot of these come down to scale. I mean, that's why organizations are going to the cloud, is that, better scalability, being able to move faster, but that can pose problems. And so, the first two that are highlighted here are really related to the fact that, you may be using different tools for different parts of the environment. Most organizations don't have a plan to go use multiple infrastructure as a service providers from the start, and they go do it. A lot of it is kind of self-service and drip over time, and then security's trying to catch up. So you're using, maybe the cloud service provider tools, and then as you bring your on-prem environment into play as well, suddenly you have this very complex security stack that's disjointed, disconnected, and costly, and that creates issues in terms of visibility and control and providing that level of consistency. The other piece here, about halfway down the list, is the impact of DevOps and that shift to agile development practices, and the fact that security can't stand in the way. Sometimes those teams are keeping security out of the loop, and it becomes incumbent on the security organization not to kind of drag those teams along, but to figure out how they can, find tools that support those agile methodologies, change their processes to better align with what's going on in DevOps, and kind of change what they're doing to better fit that model. I still think the fact that the shared security responsibility model, which is down towards the bottom, was referenced by 23%. How many years have we been doing this? And there's still some confusion there that always jumps out at me. And then even more so than that, the fact that 5% of organizations said that they were lucky enough not to have experienced any challenges, which is, I guess, the nirvana state. But if we believe the data for that particular point.
We could package that and sell it as its own thing. That's a pretty incredible experience. I did want to ask you about the 32% there, the meeting best practices. Wasn't clear to me. Is that best practices from the vendor? Maybe they have a cloud center of excellence. Like where do those best practices get defined?
Yeah, we didn't define it in the question. That could be from things like the Cloud Security Alliance, from the vendor, from other third parties or service providers. It was somewhat vague, but I think the idea of, hey, we know we're not always doing what we should, but because it's hard, we're not able to. I think was really the takeaway there.
Yeah. I guess one other thing I noticed, like those first two bullets, I've seen a lot of organizations just try to apply what we used to use in like old networking worlds. Actually, we still use it today, but a lot of use of like transit gateways to route all the traffic in and out of cloud spaces. I think, again, going back to everybody's working from home and suddenly there's a lot more traffic going through that environment. It was even harder to understand exactly who needed access and from exactly where. So some of these challenges that exist, some of them we're just carrying the old baggage thinking it'll solve it. But in a new cloud environment, we need a different approach. Actually, I guess if we're doing problem solution, I'll pop over to this slide here. This is a simple view. I want to say that I do agree, right? We've got such vastly complex IT spaces, and it's only going to continue to get more complicated. And so we've got a kind of a viewpoint here that you can really take the zero trust access policies and implement in a way that it's a unified model. And so just to sort of illustrate this in this simple box diagram, look at the stuff on the right. That's all the resources that you want to protect: the workloads, the services, the assets. And it doesn't matter where they live: public cloud, private cloud, on premises, hosted, Kubernetes, anywhere. I mean, that list will probably continue to grow. And then on the right-hand side, we normally think about users needing access to resources. And sure, we do. We've got employees who are in an office or at home or in a cafe network, or third party. We've got consultants or whomever who need access. But going in further and consider, you need to have policies that define what services can talk to other services. In a microservices world, even services have identity. And so it's important that you're able to understand the identity of the requester. That's really what's kind of illustrated here on the left-hand side. And then the magic all happens in the middle, right? This is where you have a unified policy engine that's able to take the identity and security posture of the entities on the left: people, devices, services, and compare that against the policies, the access policies you've defined for the items on the right. And then the unified policy engine goes ahead and provides the least privileged access to those assets. The example would be like Bob accesses all the HR apps, and that's no matter what network he's on, as long as he's got a device that's got an endpoint protection enabled. Or Mary is a contractor. She gets access to the internal order service, but only from the hours of 4 to 8. And both those really address items that were on the slide just above, right? Maintaining security consistency across environments. You could do that from the unified policy engine, but take it even further and say, I have a subscription management service that runs as a container in my cloud environment, and it needs access, to the billing service that runs on premises. It shouldn't be any more complicated than finding a policy like you did for the users. And so the unified policy engine can actually do that for you, but it does take, an approach toward like the zero trust style of approach. We'll continue to describe that even further, but ultimately, this begins to help address some of these other challenges in there. The lack of DevOps engagement, which was at 27%, and the need to drive the adoption of best practices, which is at 32%. Right? These approaches can get applied into DevOps environments as well. As John had mentioned, we really do need to be able to support integrating security with DevOps.
Yeah, and I think that's a great segue, Colby, to this slide, because you mentioned kind of setting permissions and access and things like that. And what we found is that their access related issues are really one of the big issues with misconfigured cloud services. So I mentioned scale before, and as you're increasing that scale, maintaining these proper configurations is more and more difficult. And so some of this stuff is really nuts and bolts. Not using a default or no password for access to the management console. You would think that, most wouldn't, but it still happens. Sometimes it's intentional and maybe just lazy, but other times it's unintentional. It slips through. But if there's no backstop there, then that obviously poses a major issue. Externally facing server workloads, we know there's going to be some that shouldn't be talking out to the internet or shouldn't be, visible on the internet. But again, as you're dealing with hundreds and thousands of workloads, some can slip through the cracks. So how can you uniformly kind of hide those from public view and make sure that attackers don't have access to them? And then, maintaining the correct permissions across, both service and user accounts. Again, difficult at scale, but you laid out kind of a good first approach, which is, starting with the fact that certain groups should only have access to certain apps and kind of, it's getting to that kind of default deny mindset, and then kind of building from there. And all this kind of points to, that need for consistency across the different aspects of the environment, making sure that, you're not relying on, these individual tools to make sure that access is kind of uniformly protected.
Yeah. Terribly complicated to go and modify all those tools just to keep up with the policy. And just incredibly difficult. Well, you're kind of hinting at some of these zero trust access fundamentals. I think these fundamentals really do help organizations make the shift here and address the challenges that we've talked about already. Look, the number one thing, like just starting off, reducing your attack surface, which is obvious. Of course, you want to do that. And that could be a non-trivial thing. But it turns out when you adopt a zero trust approach, there's an incredible capability here called single packet authentication. And this mechanism ensures that no network connection can be established with the resources unless the requester has a valid cryptographic secret, what we call a SPA token, single packet authentication token. That this mechanism cloaks all your network devices. You can't hack it. You can't attack it if you can't see it. And that's incredibly powerful. And it's one small thing in concept to lay out. And it's really incredibly powerful. You can lock out all the resources so they just can't be attacked. Even if someone were to take credentials, right? Great, they got a username password, but they don't have the SPA token, so they can't access the resource. But let's talk about the identity and context. Right. When you're thinking zero trust, it's really important that you're able to not just authenticate a particular user, but know a lot more about the user, their security posture, the security posture of the device they're using, the location, the time of day, perhaps the frequency of access. All this information feeds into your approach to zero trust that allows you to build what I think of as like a 360-degree view of identity and risk. And once you have that view, you can start to decide whether or not to allow the service, right? Your cloud application, your container, a user, an IoT device. You've got that 360 view, and then you can analyze whether or not to allow access. So here, of course, we're talking about least privilege access or default deny, right, John? And so it's important that you combine this information to only allow approved users or devices to be able to access services, and then they'll get that SPA token that allow them to get access to the resource. But that's not a one and done thing. Zero trust. Maybe you trusted them for the first 30 seconds, but anything could change at any time. And so continuous assessment is absolutely necessary, right? These really do make up the four fundamentals of zero trust. So in continuous assessment, as you'd expect, it's constantly analyzing the identity and security posture of the folks who are attempting to use your network. So in the end, you end up with this dynamic environment, right? You've reduced your attack surface by using SPA tokens or by using SPA. You've built a 360-degree identity and risk assessment. And you've granted entitlements based off least privilege access, and you're continuously analyzing all that to ensure that as soon as something falls below a trust value, you can revoke that access, limit the potential for lateral movement, or contain the blast radius of a potential attack. Really powerful, just these four basic fundamentals.
Yeah, and I think I agree with all of these, and I think sometimes 1 and 4 are kind of overlooked. I think we focus a lot on that initial verification, and least privilege gets thrown around a lot. I think that continuous assessment is because it involves kind of pulling in different telemetry. It can it's more mature, right? And so sometimes it's overlooked. And then same thing with reducing the attack surface. And that's just fundamental. I love that you have that kind of first. That should be the first thing you do, but sometimes is a bit overlooked.
That would address, we go back to this slide, that would address, I don't know, almost half of what was up on that slide. Hide it.
The misconfiguration. No, 100%.
You left the credentials out in the open. Don't worry about it. Nobody can get to it anyway.
No one can see it. Exactly.
By the way, I don't recommend you leave your credentials out in the open.
Yeah. Like the LifeLock guy who used to give out his social security.
Yeah, here's my information.
Yeah. Let's not do that. So we mentioned the kind of change in application architectures. And so we wanted to, ask in this particular study about some of the challenges with container adoption, right? So microservices is kind of fundamentally, changing the way that you have to think about securing applications. When you had the traditional kind of 3-tier app model, everything was contained. I mean, and that further when it was on-prem, very easy. Now you break that into, hundreds of ephemeral workloads, maybe used by multiple applications. It's really hard to understand those relationships and then implement security in that model. And the rate of change really makes it so you can't use your traditional approaches that were typically very manual. So what this all comes down to is really looking to improve the level of automation that's involved in some of the things that Colby was just talking about in terms of determining access. As things are spun up, policy automatically at least suggested, if not applied, to those workloads to make it easier for the security team or the application team to click, yep, let's accept that policy and move forward. And back to what I said previously, where the security technology really has to fit into those DevOps practices. Security is not going to drag the groups that are using containers kind of back to the way they want to do things. They have to adapt and find ways to support how the app teams are using containers and other microservices.
Yeah, if we take this approach to like using ZTA to help in securing your cloud environments, it's really important that there's automation, that there are APIs ready, that these are tools that the dev teams can use and that security can use, understand, and ultimately control. If we're able to help get the security teams and the DevOps teams working together, then I think we help organizations meet what's on that title there, right? Securing at the speed of business. I don't expect businesses to abandon microservices. It's really helping them be much more responsive to the market, responsive to competitors, bring innovation to market faster. So it's important that your zero trust approach takes into account like these sort of four components here. Right? It has to be able to address micro segmentation, container to container conversations, container, your north-south traffic, containers to outbound services. Not just can a user get access to the application in the container in your cluster. So it has to be able to do that, and it still in that same way where it's using identity and least privilege access, and the policies that get defined and reevaluated, as we mentioned earlier, are dynamically evaluated. Right? We're constantly doing analysis to make sure, yes, this container should continue to be allowed to have access to this other container or external resource. And then should there be any change in trust, you go ahead and you remove that. That sort of live environment, when you're defining the policies, when you're trying to figure out what containers are talking to what, or what services need to get access to external resources, right? That's a discovery thing that you'd want to do as part of your DevOps practice. So it's really important that your zero trust approach is part of a dev or DevSecOps practice here. And that's what I call it here with integration and automation, right? APIs are essential here. Dev teams, DevOps teams require automation everywhere, and you're only going to get that through APIs, really. So it's got to fit seamlessly into that process. And then finally, I just think about the consistent experience. There are a lot of different ways we could talk about this, but one thing that I don't think is reflected here is consider that when you define policies for applications as you're going through a dev practice, when you move into staging, pre-prod or UAT, however you call it, and then into production, you want those applications to have a consistent security policy all the way through. So, you can take this approach where you're defining security, even going so far as security as code, and allowing that policy to continue to migrate with the app. So no matter where you place it, the security policy is consistently applied. And that's also going to be really great for organizations who might be taking apps that are on-prem and then moving them into the cloud. Lots of benefits in here. Oh, right. So I keep talking about Appgate. I forgot I had this whole section here where I wanted to just to share with you some more details, but actually I've covered quite a bit, and probably the best thing I could do here is summarize some of the core design principles behind what we've done to build Appgate SDP. And Appgate SDP is our secured access solution. It achieves a lot of the goals and objectives that we've talked about already, and it's based off these principles. So cloaked infrastructure, I'm a huge fan of this, right? The idea of using single packet authorization to cloak all of your network resources. So nobody can attack it because they can't even find it. And that's incredibly powerful. That's a critical component there. And then, of course, identity-centric. I know I keep hammering on this, but it's so important. It's not just the user and their password and they got authenticated with an identity provider, but what's the status of the machine that they're on, the network that they're on, the time of day that they're there. If it's if it doesn't have to be a person, it could be the service. Is the service behaving properly? Has it been recently scanned for vulnerabilities? Like that kind of information is really important to help you understand the full context of who wants access. And then dynamic and continuous analysis, constantly evaluating identity and risk to ensure whether or not something should continue to have access. And then defining micro perimeters. And for Appgate SDP, this is just how the system works. It's automatically setting up these like micro firewalls, what we call a segment of one. So the individual has just a secured access to only the resources they're supposed to have that they're only supposed to have. There's no lateral attack there because the pipe only allows the connection to the resource or each of the individual resources that they're supposed to have. And then ultimately, we're talking about programmable and adaptable. The Appgate SDP platform's been designed and is implemented to be 100% driven by APIs. Of course, we have great, powerful tools, and we fit in automation tools already. But you can fully automate and build it into a system that works for your processes, whether that's HR systems for onboarding or offboarding employees, or even in ticketing systems to automatically grant access to somebody in IT who has to debug a system. And then you can automatically revoke their access once the ticket's been closed. So five core principles. And I know earlier we talked about a number of use cases. There really are like dozens of use cases for zero trust. And what we found is that customers often start with, even if they have the high strategic goal of getting to zero trust everywhere, they start with a use case that's important to their business to prove it out and to learn how to change not just technology, but processes, practices, so they can build that rigor and then expand it. Like we talked about earlier, right, John? So they'll move into like that 46%. Next year, we'll see it be 58%, 75%. So there are a lot of benefits to adopting zero trust. There are a lot of benefits to adopting Appgate SDP in particular. We contracted a third-party research firm to go out and reach into all of our customers and ask them about the benefits. What were their experiences working with Appgate? And I'll just call out a few. Like the first one here, 9.5 out of 10. This is customers who rated Appgate SDP as being strategic to their zero trust approach. So it was important that we were there to help them, and it will continue to be strategic as they continue to expand their zero trust strategy out across a larger organization. And if you look at like 119% accelerates digital transformation, this is looking at customers asking them, hey, before you started using Appgate, tell us where you're at with your digital transformation. And they gave it a rating somewhere between 1 and 10. And then we asked, well, after you've applied, you've rolled out Appgate SDP, how do you rate your digital transformation? And again, on that scale of 1 to 10, and what we found was customers were on average getting about 119, 120% improvement. Like they're getting through their digital transformation journey faster. Last one I want to poke at because it just kind of it looks funny on the slide here. 79% reduced provisioning staff. Our customers did not say that they reduced their staff by 79%. What they said was that for the security and networking tasks that they have, it took less effort for them to get that work done. So it really meant that they were able to take 79% of their overall staffing resources and apply them to other business challenges. So, if you're in security, if you're in networking, you certainly know you've got a long queue of stuff to do. Well, what happens if you didn't have as many tickets and you could go and do something more interesting, compelling for your business? That's really what that's about. So last thing, before I hand it over to John to summarize his key takeaways, I just wanted to share with you a handful of resources that you may find useful, some additional background on zero trust, some additional background on us. So there's the product page there at the top. There's third-party research that further describes and really does take a critical look at Appgate SDP and helps you understand why we continue to be a leader in this market. We've got a great security podcast series. It's been a lot of fun to listen to, and it brings together industry experts to talk about issues, trends, and technology related to ZTA. And then we've got a weekly demo. So you can just sign up, jump in on one of these sessions where we're every week walking through the product and answering questions. It's a great way to do that without having to invest too much time, but you'll learn a whole bunch. So that's my background. John, I hand it back over to you for key takeaways.
Perfect. And yeah, just a couple. These are really focused on once you've developed your strategy and kind of choosing tools. But I just want to highlight a couple of things that you said, because I think they were spot on. Determining and kind of planning based on the business need. What's going to best enable the businesses to succeed? What's the strategic business priorities, and kind of mapping zero trust to that helps in a lot of ways. I mentioned, working with DevOps specifically, but there's a lot of other roles that are going to be involved in this. And so building cross-functional kind of buy-in and collaboration earlier is always great. And then again, you mentioned kind of navigating that use case specific view, but maybe having a longer term plan. So you're not kind of getting pigeonholed with technology. So have that long-term view, but look for how you're going to get quick wins and help the business early and often. But once you've done that and you're actually looking for tools that are going to support the strategy, we've identified a few critical attributes based on our research, and they really come down to consistency, risk, automation, and flexibility. So we touched on how organizations are supporting these hybrid multi-cloud environments. I know the topic of today's talk was really cloud, but you can't forget on-prem. So that's consistency is really, the top attribute organizations are looking for in tools supporting zero trust. And whether that's, on-prem and cloud or different clouds and different architectures, it's something important to keep in mind. Colby, again, mentioned risk a number of times. So being able to bring those risk assessment capabilities into decisions when you're making access, add that contextual awareness to make informed decisions, and to do so, in real time and in automated fashion, which is also important. You can't, secure cloud environments. You can't properly deploy zero trust if you're relying on kind of manual policy updates and decision making. And so I think, from a vendor perspective, the capabilities in this area have come a long way in a couple of years. It's something I know they're all investing in. It's going to continue to get better, and that's really going to be key to kind of advancing the zero trust narrative. And then finally, integrations, with things like identity providers, analytics, endpoint agents. No single vendor is going to be able to provide a platform for zero trust, even that touches on most of the capabilities you need for zero trust. And so someone who can kind of plug into a broader ecosystem and allow you to consume kind of best of breed capabilities, and do so, across your environment through the vendors you're already using is really important. And we're going to see that as those strategies go from use case specific to, broader throughout the environment. This is going to become even more important. So with that, I will turn it back over to Deb, I believe.
Thank you, John and Colby. As a reminder, a recording of today's presentation will be made available on demand after the event for those of you who are asking in the chat window for copies of the deck. Also, if you have a question, select the Q&A button at the bottom of the console. If we are not able to answer your question during this webcast, you'll receive an email response to it within a few days. Okay, now I'm scouring our questions here from the audience to see what we've got. The first one is actually very thought-provoking. How does the introduction of zero trust change roles and responsibilities between security, IT, networking, and cloud teams? And do you have any best practices for arranging these responsibilities?
I can start on that, Colby, unless you
go ahead.
So, yeah, absolutely. It's going to require all these teams to work more closely together. We see a lot of interest in formalizing some of that cross-functional collaboration through centers of excellence. That's still incredibly early. Most organizations aren't doing that yet, but a majority are interested or planning for that. And so you mentioned kind of IT, cloud, and security, maybe networking. I'm not sure if that was mentioned in the question, but then as we said, the app teams, line of business, there's so many different personas and roles that are going to be involved in this, that there needs to be some formalization. And I think you're going to see, we saw this with cloud and cloud centers of excellence. I think you'll see more and more of that on the zero trust side.
I would kind of echo that as well. I think it, you're not going to see so much changes in the roles. Look, security experts will be security experts, network experts or network experts, dev or dev experts. One of the keywords that John used there was collaboration. But moving towards this direction here really can allow these different organizations to collaborate much more effectively and efficiently. So I think that'll be probably the biggest change. It's how we do the work, less so maybe who does the work.
Excellent. Okay, now we have another question from the audience. It's actually repeated twice, so I'm going to go ahead and ask this. I think it's directed towards Colby, but it doesn't say, but it's around the product. What is the methodology for your tool set to assess risk?
It's a good question. So within the product itself, there are lots of different ways you can assess risk. I mean, you can get specific analysis about user devices. So device claims, user claims, there's information that our own system is able to gather about the environment and about the identity, right? That identity context. And then that you can use when you're defining the conditions for entitlements. So right in that world, you're actually defining what are the risk levels, what are the conditions that would allow the system to grant access to a user. There are other ways to do that. If you're going to combine multiple things, make it even more complicated. Certainly, you could customize some of the scripts that we have to make that happen. But very often, what we find is customers combine the risk scores that come from additional third parties, right? As John pointed out, no one tool is going to be able to answer your ZTA solution. There's not one thing that does it. So you've already probably made investments with antivirus, endpoint protection systems, SIM tools, things like that. So all those different tools that you may already have in your environment can feed their information into Appgate. And so then Appgate can make it a policy decision based off the risk scores that either you've determined or you're using the third party to do it. A really good way to see that in action it would be to jump on one of those live demos I mentioned. Hope that helps.
Okay, excellent. Yes, I was just waiting to make sure there wasn't any more that needed to be said. We have a very engaged audience today. Another one of our questions came out asking about frictionless access and authentication. Can you cover and expand on that, please? Empowering developers to use end users with frictionless, just-in-time, zero-trust access?
Oh, yeah. So I guess it depends on how we want to interpret frictionless access. But I personally, I think about this as ensuring that the policies that you define work no matter where the user is at any time. So if your developers were accessing resources because they were all on-prem, and then due to COVID, they had to go back home, right? You don't want to have an environment where they have to set up a new VPN thing and there have to be a whole new set of rules for how they're going to be able to connect, and there's different endpoints, right? It should be a seamless experience. So as a developer, I should be able to get to GitHub and Jira and all the other tools that I'm using exactly the same way every time, no matter where I'm at. I think that's one of the key parts there. John, I don't know if you have anything else to add there.
Yeah, the only other piece is just ensuring it's not just kind of consistency, but for lack of a more eloquent way of saying it, making sure that they don't have to jump through hoops to get that access, I think. And that goes for users. I know we're talking about developers here, but for regular users, they really shouldn't see any of this going. It should be they're kind of natively accessing the application. And so for developers, if they need some sort of privileged access and they may need to request it, just in time, doing it so it happens very quickly and they're not held up. I think that's the key point. For the question that was asked, but that's a broader kind of zero trust tenet as well. Like if this gets in the way of users doing their job, then it's not going to work, and it's kind of failed in its purpose.
Well, I'll also expand on a scenario I described earlier, which it doesn't have to necessarily be developer focused, but it is really interesting about frictionless and like just in time. So we have a customer, a handful, but one I'm thinking of that had done this integration with their ServiceNow environment. So, when a ticket gets filed about a system that needs to be looked at, then the ticket, as long as it's open and it has identified the IT resource who should be able to access it, that policy assignment happens automatically. Appgate automatically knows that there's a ServiceNow ticket that's for a particular resource, and it knows which user or group should be allowed to have access. And so as the person in IT, I would actually just be able to go right to the resource I need to go and troubleshoot, do whatever analysis I can. And then when the ticket gets closed, my access is automatically revoked. That's frictionless. Like, I didn't have to request any access, and nobody had to go out and do anything special for me. That it happened right away, and it was just in time. I got it when I needed it, and it got pulled when I didn't need it any longer.
Okay, and it looks like we have another question for Colby. Let me see here. I got to read this in the right. It's not exactly dictionary correct. What are the main reasons Appgate's clients decide to engage with your zero trust access solution?
Wow. There are lots of reasons why organizations would choose Appgate. It depends oftentimes of your particular use cases and where you're at. I'd say some things that really do help set our platform apart. Right? We do hyper focus on solving the secured access problem. That we've got the SPA token capabilities baked in. So that's a huge thing. Just to be able to immediately cloak all of your assets is just enormous. And then to have this flexible model where the identity and context can come in from anywhere. Any service, resource, device, like we're able to get a tremendous amount of information, and then to use that to continuously analyze, the risk and decide whether or not to grant access. Those are really powerful bits. In a lot of places, we're talking about cloud, almost everywhere where we're seeing cloud and microservices, the API is a huge, huge enabler. Just not just the API for integrating with the third parties, but to ensure that Appgate as itself fits inside their existing environments and can work with like dev teams. Big question, actually. Thanks for asking.
That's what I thought. All these questions have been good questions. Thank you, audience, for your feedback. We're going to have to wrap it. We're at the top of the hour now. So if you have any more questions that haven't been answered, you will receive a response to them in the next couple of days via email. I want to thank our audience for tuning in and for all your helpful questions. I want to thank John and Colby for the information, and a special thanks to Appgate for sponsoring this helpful webcast.
Thank you, Deb. Thanks, John.
Yep. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone, for listening in. Hope you're all well.